They said the move was supposed to be a fresh start, a clean slate, something different for a family that had been exposed, criticized, filmed, and ultimately separated from the people who depended on them most. After Adult Protective Services stepped in and removed Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray, the assumption was that Betty and Larry would finally take steps to change their living conditions. New home, new life, and a chance to show the state they could take care of themselves. But what happened next was nothing anyone expected. In the small town of Odd, West Virginia, word spread fast that the Whittakers had escaped their old trailer. They packed their belongings, grabbed what they could carry, and drove away from the place that had become a tourist attraction for exploitation. No more constant strangers pulling up, cameras rolling. No more fans showing up unannounced with snacks in one hand and a phone in the other, fishing for reactions like they were visiting a zoo. They moved to a new cabin, a smaller, more hidden location, a place no one could easily find. The message was clear: leave us alone. But when reporters and content creators finally found the home and stepped inside, what they discovered wasn't a fresh start. It was the same exact reality as before, just in a new location. Roaches crawling over counters, beds pushed against walls with no sheets or pillows, pots and pans sitting on a gas stove filled with days-old beans and sausage, trash outside, clothes hanging in random places, odd decorations, Halloween skeletons dangling in the yard, tires and boxes stacked near the porch. The move didn't change anything. They weren't trying to hide the mess. They weren't embarrassed by it either. They were simply living how they had always lived. To them, nothing had changed. To the state, everything should have. But you can't change what you don't see is wrong. Without Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray in the home, many people assumed Betty and Larry would have more time to organize, clean, and maybe even learn how to maintain things. Instead, the opposite happened. They became quieter, more isolated. They seemed lost without the ones they cared for. They weren't caretakers anymore. They were just two people alone in a home that wasn't built for them to survive comfortably. And then came the biggest shock of all. BJ was still there. Yes, BJ, the woman who Betty herself once claimed had put hands on Timmy. The same woman Betty wrote a restraining order against. The woman who demanded money for drugs and allegedly threatened the family. The woman who Adult Protective Services likely saw as a danger to the vulnerable adults in the home. And yet, according to multiple content creators who visited, BJ was sitting on the couch with Betty and Larry like nothing had ever happened. She was hanging out in the home, wearing shark slippers that had been sent as a gift for Timmy, answering questions like she belonged there. People asked, why is she still around? The answer was simple and complicated at the same time. She never left. The moment cameras stopped rolling, the moment decisions needed to be made to protect the family, Betty opened the door right back to the same person the state believed was unsafe. And what message did that send to the system trying to help them? That nothing would change. Not even if the state intervened. Not even if the kids were gone. Not even for their own protection. Neighbors and locals said BJ's presence had never truly disappeared, even after the restraining order, even after the claims of violence. She was still the one Betty trusted, still the one helping, still the one they leaned on. And in the strange code of loyalty that exists in hidden places like Odd, it didn't matter what outsiders said. It didn't matter what cameras recorded. It didn't matter what Betty admitted on video. BJ was family to them. And family doesn't get kicked out. At least, not in their world. While the internet was debating DNA tests, content creators were fighting each other for views, and the New York Post was publishing exposés, Betty and Larry were simply trying to survive the way they always had. When the state took 3 people from them, they didn't adapt. They grieved. They didn't clean. They shut down. They didn't separate from the person accused of abuse. They clung to the only help they had left. People online love to yell, "Betty doesn't care." Larry doesn't try. How can they live like that? But nobody ever stops to ask, who taught them how to live differently? Who took the time to show Betty how to manage a household when she couldn't read, couldn't organize finances, and relied on instinct more than instruction? Who taught Larry anything beyond survival? Who offered help that wasn't attached to cameras and contracts? Who stayed after the view count dropped? Who visited when there was no content to film? People want a success story, but the Whittakers were never treated like a family to build up. They were treated like characters to observe, collect, share, and disconnect from when the audience got bored. Nobody invested in teaching them basic life skills. They invested in content, interviews, likes, and documentaries. Now the most vulnerable, the ones who could not advocate for themselves, are gone. And Betty and Larry are alone in a world they don't understand. Still waiting for a phone call that hasn't come. Still hoping someone will tell them where their loved ones are. Still holding on to the person the state likely saw as a threat, because in their mind, that person helped them survive. Maybe this isn't a story about filthy houses or weird families. Maybe it's a story about what happens to people who are never given tools, education, structure, or guidance. People who were filmed for entertainment instead of help to build a life. They didn't escape their old trailer. They escaped the cameras. But they didn't escape their reality. Because nobody taught them how. What do you think? Should someone step in to help Betty and Larry learn to live independently? Or is it too late for change? Share your thoughts below. The new cabin was supposed to be proof that things were improving. Proof that Betty and Larry were ready to live differently. Proof that they could change if given a clean slate. But the more people looked closely, the more obvious it became. Moving didn't fix anything. It simply relocated the same problems to a different address. Everyone online kept repeating the same question. Why don't they clean? Why don't they take care of the home? To most people, it's common sense. Clean your house. Pick up trash. Keep bugs away. But common sense is only common if someone taught it to you. And for Betty and Larry, life was never about structure, cleanliness, or schedules. It was about surviving with what they had, however they could. They never learned routines. They never learned hygiene standards. They never learned money management, organization, or planning. They learned how to get by, not how to live well. For generations, everything around them was survival-driven. A good day wasn't a day where the house was spotless. A good day was a day with food, heat, cigarettes, or a working stove. That was victory, not a clean kitchen, not swept floors, not knowing the correct way to store food so it didn't go bad. Those priorities didn't exist. They weren't taught. They weren't modeled. They weren't required to survive an odd. That's the part outsiders don't understand. You cannot blame someone for not doing what they were never taught. Even when content creators arrived and tried to clean, they only cleared the surface. They removed trash, swept the floors, and organized clothing. But they didn't stay long enough to teach what goes into maintaining a household. Cleaning isn't a one-time fix. It's a learned habit, a lifetime of repetition. Something that becomes second nature. Betty never learned it. Larry never learned it. Why would they magically start now, at this age, under stress, without the family they cared for? The removal of Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray wasn't just a safety decision. It was an emotional blow that left Betty and Larry mentally paralyzed. They lost their purpose. The daily routine of feeding someone, helping someone bathe, reminding someone to eat or sit. Those routines were all they knew. Caregiving wasn't just a responsibility. It was their identity. Without the three of them, who were Betty and Larry, it's uncomfortable to think about, but it's true. They don't know how to live without people depending on them. They don't know how to care for themselves. It feels pointless to keep house when the ones they once cared for aren't coming home. And instead of strengthening their will to fight for visitation, the loneliness made them revert further into old habits. Instead of cleaning, they shut down. Instead of learning something new, they clung to the familiar. Instead of separating from the person the state viewed as a danger, they welcomed her back because BJ brought chaos, but also company. Loneliness is louder than logic. People see roaches and trash and ask, how could they live like this? But those insects were not what bothered them the most. What bothered them was the empty space where three familiar faces used to sit. They didn't feel disgusted by the conditions. They felt devastated by the absence. The new cabin didn't symbolize hope. It symbolized loss. And they filled that loss with the only thing left: routine. Routine with BJ. Routine with clutter. Routine with the same meals, same habits, same isolation. It's easy to say, just fix it. But who teaches them how to fix it? Who checks on them and ensures they're learning? Who sits down and shows Betty how to properly store food or clean a kitchen? Who teaches Larry how to uphold healthy boundaries, manage finances, and stop relying on people who harm more than they help? Nobody is doing that. Not the content creators. Not the fans. Not the system. Adult Protective Services didn't step in to support Betty and Larry. They stepped in to protect the vulnerable adults in their care. That's the harsh truth. The state intervened out of safety, not rehabilitation. APS wasn't there to teach Betty how to parent or how to keep a home. Their job was to remove the people who needed more protection than Betty and Larry could give. Once that mission was complete, the system stepped back. And that's why Betty and Larry are stuck in the same life, just in a different building. Then comes the financial side. People donated thousands of dollars to the family through content creators. Trucks were gifted, groceries delivered, money raised. Yet none of that changed anything. Why? Because you can give someone a house, a car, or a refrigerator full of food, but if they never learned how to maintain any of it, it all collapses back into chaos. It's the same problem poverty organizations report worldwide. Giving resources without teaching skills doesn't create change. It creates dependency. The Whittakers became a viral sensation. They became a subject for debate. They became content, but they never became empowered. Donations came and went. Cameras came and went. But real help, the kind that requires time, slow teaching, patience, and consistency, never arrived. Real help isn't viral. Real help isn't fast. Real help isn't entertaining. It requires someone to come back week after week to show them the same tasks over and over until they stick. It requires patience through frustration, mess, regression, and emotional outbursts. It requires support that doesn't leave when the views stop coming. Nobody has offered that, not even the well-meaning ones. So, Betty and Larry are still living in squalor not because they refuse to change, but because no one has ever taught them how to change. Moving didn't change them because houses don't teach life skills. Donations don't build understanding. Viral fame doesn't create education. If we really want to see improvement, someone has to get involved. Who cares more about progress than content? Someone has to show up to teach, not to document. To help, not to expose. To empower, not to pity. To build, not to broadcast. Until then, Betty and Larry won't escape anything. Not even if they keep moving. Do you believe someone should be hired to help teach Betty and Larry life skills? Or should the state step in again with support, not punishment? Share your thoughts below. Everyone keeps asking why Betty and Larry are still living like this if the three family members were removed. People assumed that once the system stepped in, once Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray were taken to safety, the whole situation would magically reset. But that isn't how life works when a family has spent generations navigating isolation, poverty, and disability without real support. The truth is far more uncomfortable than any viral clip. The Whittakers aren't just trapped in their living conditions. They're trapped in generational cycles that nobody has ever broken. Removing the three vulnerable adults didn't cure the root problem. It only separated the symptoms from the source. The system saved those who could be saved for now, but it didn't rescue the ones who were left behind. And for Betty and Larry, that meant one painful reality. They were left alone without guidance, without purpose, without direction, and without the only people who made life make sense. What happens to caregivers when the people they take care of are gone? Most people don't think about that part. The removals were done to protect the vulnerable. But does anyone think about the ones who spent decades caring for them with almost no knowledge, no resources, and no alternatives? When Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray were taken away, Betty and Larry didn't just lose household members. They lost their roles. They lost their identity. They lost the only structure they ever had. Think about it. For over 40 years, Betty's days revolve around the same routine. Waking up, making basic meals, checking on the kids, calming behaviors, bathing them, watching over them. Even if she did it imperfectly, that life was all she knew. Her identity was built around being needed, even if she wasn't fully equipped to handle it. Larry, too, wasn't just living there. He was the one who drove, who fetched supplies when possible, who communicated with outsiders and fought, in his own flawed ways, to protect the family. He never learned to organize finances, manage repairs, or handle household systems. He learned to survive and to keep a watchful eye. His job wasn't running a home. His job was protecting a family who couldn't protect themselves. When the three were removed, Betty and Larry became two people with an empty life. Suddenly, there was nothing left to do, no caregiving tasks, no routines, no supervision, no purpose, no meaning. And that's the first reason they fell apart even more. 1. Losing a caregiving role can collapse someone mentally. People don't realize how deeply caregiving bonds shape a person. When you take away the people a caregiver has dedicated their life to, especially a caregiver with limited support, education, or experience, you also take away their identity. Think about parents who become empty nesters once kids grow up and leave home. Many struggle emotionally, even when their children are healthy, functioning adults. Now multiply that by 1,000. Betty didn't parent children who would grow up, move out, and become independent. She parented adults who would never be independent. Her caregiving role didn't just end. It was ripped away from her. Imagine the emotional whiplash. One day, she bathes Lorraine. The next day, Lorraine is gone. One day, Ray sleeps on the couch in the same position he has for 30 years. The next day, his presence is replaced by silence and an empty cushion. One day, Timmy sits at the table eating noodles. The next day, his bowl, his chair, his voice, his habits all vanish. That kind of sudden loss doesn't just disrupt a routine. It breaks a person's spirit. And when someone is heartbroken, overwhelmed, and lost, cleanliness and organization become irrelevant. 2. You can't learn new habits from a place of grief. People say, why don't they clean their home? But when someone is grieving, depressed, or confused, especially someone with limited education and coping skills, learning to manage life better becomes extremely difficult. Motivation disappears. Self-care disappears. Mess becomes a symptom of emotional collapse, not laziness. Betty isn't choosing filth. She's choosing survival without purpose. Larry isn't choosing clutter. He's choosing what's familiar, because familiarity is the only control he has left. When people are overwhelmed, they cling to what they know. The same food, the same habits, the same people, the same environment. And that means they cling to BJ not because she is safe, stable, or helpful, but because she is familiar. To outsiders, BJ is a disaster. To Betty and Larry, she is a part of their routine, a familiar face in a life full of loss. 3. Removing the vulnerable didn't fix the environment. Even if Betty and Larry wanted to improve, they were never taught how. And the state didn't stay behind to help them transition into a new life. APS protected Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray. But they didn't protect the caregivers emotionally, mentally, or practically. This is the core issue. The state rescued 3 adults, but they didn't rehabilitate the caretakers. The state provided safety, but not education. The state removed the vulnerable, but left the untrained caregivers alone with all their dysfunction and no guidance. Without help, the home reverted to chaos. The habits returned. The emotional collapse deepened. The same lifestyle continued. You can't fix what you don't know how to fix. You can't become what you've never been taught to become. For poverty keeps people stuck in survival mode. Most people don't understand what it means to live in poverty so severe that survival becomes your entire personality. Poverty changes how your brain makes decisions. Studies show that extreme poverty creates a psychological state where people focus only on short-term needs, not long-term solutions. Here's what survival mode looks like. Eat whatever is available. Use whatever is around you. Keep the heat on only when necessary. Accept help from whoever offers it, even if they're harmful. Do the bare minimum to get through the day. Survival mode is about the next meal, not the next plan. It's about putting out fires, not preventing them. It's about today. Tomorrow doesn't exist yet. That is the Whittaker lifestyle. And moving didn't turn survival mode into stability. 5. Poverty without education creates dependency. When content creators arrived with money, food, and attention, they unintentionally deepened the dependency. Donations are fast solutions. They don't build skills. They replace effort with handouts. And while the intentions may have been good, the effect was predictable. They gave food, but didn't teach cooking safety. They gave money, but didn't teach budgeting. They cleaned, but didn't teach maintenance. They provided transportation, but didn't teach independence. So instead of empowerment, the donations reinforced one truth. Someone else will fix things. This is why Betty and Larry didn't fight to learn. They never needed to. Someone always came along to help, even if the help was inconsistent or chaotic, even if it brought cameras and exploitation. Help was help, and that habit replaced growth. 6. Their new escape is only physical, not psychological. The cabin is different, but Betty and Larry are still the same people with the same limitations, same heartache, and same lack of guidance. They escaped their old house. They did not escape their old life. Until someone breaks the cycles that created their situation, they will remain stuck. They will repeat familiar habits. Their environment will always decay, and their emotional wounds will grow deeper. Change requires more than relocation, more than cleaning, more than donations, more than pity. Change requires education, support, long-term care, rehabilitation. It requires someone who shows up not once, not twice, not when the camera is rolling, but week after week, month after month, with patience and structure. Until then, Betty and Larry aren't escaping anything. They're just waiting for news of the 3 people who gave their life meaning. Waiting for visits that still haven't happened. Waiting for a knock at the door that proves someone cares not about content, but about them. Small Orange Diamond, do you think the state should provide ongoing support to Betty and Larry as caregivers, especially since they were never trained to care for disabled adults? Small Orange Diamond, or should community service agencies, not YouTubers, be stepping in now? Speech balloons, share your thoughts below. Everyone believes the Whittakers escaped something. They believe the removal of Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray was an ending, a rescue, a dramatic turning point. And sure, it was a turning point, but it didn't turn toward a new life. It turned toward a deeper question. What happens to the people left behind when the system saves the ones who cannot save themselves? Most people don't think about that part. They see Betty and Larry still living in filth, still surrounded by clutter, still dependent on the same unstable people. And they ask, why are they still living like this? But the question we should be asking is much bigger. How could they possibly live any other way without the support they were never given? The world expected an escape, a transformation, a miracle. Instead, what we're watching is an unfinished intervention. Because here's the truth nobody wants to talk about. 1. The state removed the dependents but never rehabilitated the caregivers. Adult Protective Services had one mission: protect the disabled adults. And they did. They secured them housing, medical support, and supervised care. That part of the story worked exactly as intended. But what were Betty and Larry left with? No training, no therapy, no continued support, no roadmap for life after caretaking. They were simply left behind with empty routines and decades of habits they never learned to break. Caregivers who have spent a lifetime managing disability often don't know how to function when the care stops, especially when they did it without training or knowledge to begin with. If the state truly believed Betty and Larry were not fit to care for the 3 vulnerable adults, then why did they assume Betty and Larry were suddenly fit to care for themselves? 2. Removing the vulnerable didn't erase poverty or disability. People forget that Betty and Larry themselves are vulnerable in their own ways. Poverty changes brain functioning. Extreme isolation changes how a person sees the world. Generational trauma affects decision-making the same way genetics affects development. Betty wasn't surviving because she was capable. She was surviving because survival didn't require improvement. Larry wasn't a provider. He was a shield against chaos. Once the 3 disabled adults were removed, the system acted like the problem just disappeared. But what disappeared instead were purpose, structure, social interaction, government oversight, donations based on sympathy. They didn't escape. They were cut off. 3. Fame was a curse disguised as help. When cameras arrived, they brought curiosity, sympathy, and exploitation all at once. Money showed up, but responsibility didn't. Viewers threw in donations without understanding that sudden financial gifts can hurt government benefit eligibility. Content creators treated the family like a viral sideshow. They weren't offered education. They were offered spectacle. People brought groceries and gifts, not stability. They fixed a moment, not a life. And the Whittakers learned something dangerous. Chaos brings help. Order brings nothing. So when their life spiraled again, filth, clutter, BJ returning, the same habits resurfacing, part of them expected someone else to step in again. Why wouldn't they? That pattern had worked for years. For the environment reflects emotional collapse. People focus on the roaches, the beans left on the stove, the mess, the dirt, but they ignore the psychology behind it. When people are overwhelmed and grieving, daily tasks become meaningless. When your emotional life is broken, your physical space breaks right along with it. The mess isn't dirt. The mess is despair. The clutter isn't laziness. It's the visual form of hopelessness. And nobody taught them how to rebuild a life without the 3 people who define their existence. 5. They're stuck between 2 worlds, watched but abandoned. Here's the irony. Before the videos, they were ignored by society. After the videos, they were watched by society, but still ignored in every meaningful way. People talk about them endlessly. People argue about them online. People profit from their story. But who is? Teaching them life skills? Monitoring their mental health? Offering long-term government support? Providing therapy or training? Cleaning with education, not pity? Helping them apply for stable disability resources? making sure they don't fall into worse conditions? The answer is simple. No one. They are famous enough to be judged, but not important enough to be helped. 6. The state took away the symptoms but not the cause. Taking Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray was like removing a burning stove from a house on fire. Yes, it stopped one problem, but the structure of the house, the foundation, the electrical wiring, the walls, was still rotten and unstable. You can't solve generational trauma with one emergency intervention. You can't fix learned helplessness with a removal order. You can't replace decades of care with a silent goodbye. Without rehabilitation, the cycle simply continues. Except now, Betty and Larry are alone in it, with nobody watching them, nobody guiding them, and nobody depending on them. 7. The most painful truth: they don't know how to live free. People assume freedom means opportunity. But for people who have never experienced real freedom, it means confusion, emptiness, and fear. Freedom requires knowledge, options, confidence, support, skills. They have none. They've never had any. So what looks like freedom to outsiders, finally living without the burden of caring for 3 disabled adults, is actually a nightmare of uncertainty for them. They don't know how to live differently. They don't know how to want differently. And until someone teaches them, they will always default to the only lifestyle they understand. So what now? What future is possible? Here's what a real escape would require, not just for the removed 3, but for Betty and Larry. A real intervention must include heavy checkmark long-term case management, heavy checkmark education on basic home maintenance, heavy checkmark therapy for grief, codependency, and trauma, heavy checkmark financial literacy support, heavy checkmark caregiver training, even if they no longer care for anyone, heavy checkmark monitoring that is supportive, not punitive, heavy checkmark community-based programs through social services, heavy checkmark adult education opportunities tailored to cognitive level, heavy checkmark regular wellness checks. Without these support systems, their situation will worsen. Not because they're bad, not because they don't care, but because nobody ever taught them how to care for themselves in the first place. The world expected change, but change requires more than rescue. A true escape means transformation, not relocation, not separation, not temporary help, and definitely not online sympathy. Until real services replace viral attention, the Whittaker story will remain unfinished. The 3 who were taken may finally get support, structure, and safety. But the 2 left behind will continue to live in a cycle that nobody ever cared to break, only to film. In the end, the real tragedy isn't that the Whittakers lived in isolation for decades. The tragedy is that even after the world discovered them, they're still alone. Speech Balloon, do you think Betty and Larry deserve state-funded rehabilitation, even though the ones they cared for are gone? Should the government be responsible, or should the community step in with real support, not cameras? Backhand index pointing down, share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.